Hi, I'm Luke Goembel, Vice President of the Central Maryland Beekeepers Association. I'm going to show you how to brew with honey. First of all, some precautions. Putting yeast, sugars, and water in gas-tight containers is dangerous. Exploding bottles are messy, possibly harmful for people who brew at home. Be sure you investigate and accept the risks inherent in home brewing and bottling before you brew and bottle. And consider using plastic bottles instead of glass to prevent severe injury, using sulfites to kill the yeast, using sugar substitutes instead of sugars, and so on. So what's to do? Let's brew. If the only thing you've been doing with your honey is bottling it, you're missing out on the joys of brewing with honey. Let's start by brewing delicious old-time root beer, far better than the preservative-laden corn syrup swill sold in stores. So why brew root beer? It's a good introduction to brewing. It's low cost in time, effort, and materials, and you get almost immediate results. And finally, it's fun for everyone. No need to be over 21 to drink home-brewed root beer. So here are some materials you'll need to make your root beer. A 2-gallon pot and 2 gallons of water, a thermometer, root beer extract, a quart of honey, and 1/2 teaspoon of dry active yeast. I use plain old dry active bread yeast for making root beer. Additional equipment for root beer includes cappable bottles, a bottling wand, caps, and a capper. And the procedure for making root beer consists of preparing the bottles, preparing the must, that's the root beer without the yeast added, then starting the yeast, pitching the yeast, that is putting the yeast into the brew so that it will ferment, and then racking the prepared brew into bottles for fermentation and future use. And finally, the brew must be refrigerated after it's carbonated, which I'll explain later. So here we see how to prepare the must. That is everything that's in the root beer but the yeast. I heat the water so that the honey will dissolve quickly, and I heat it to no more than 100 degrees. Any hotter and it will kill the yeast and it won't ferment and produce carbonation. Then I add a quart to 2 gallons of water, a quart of honey to 2 gallons of water. And stir until dissolved. Then I prepare the yeast, which will ferment the brew and create carbonation so you get a nice fizzy root beer. I add a little honey to my water before adding the yeast. That gives the yeast a good start. I am using dry active bread yeast, 1/2 teaspoon for a 2 gallon batch. And I mix it thoroughly. Then, after about 15 minutes, when I've proofed the yeast, I pitch it, I add extract, and then I aerate. See, there's a nice foam. The yeast has proofed. Pitching consists of simply pouring the yeast mixture into the must. Now it's a brew. I add root beer extract, a full bottle that says enough for 5 gallons. I find I like a stronger root beer. Then I set the timer for about 2 minutes. Use a whisk and aerate all the contents in the brew. Aeration is important for strong, healthy yeast development. Now I will rack the resulting brew into bottles, and this is a slow way, the old way for me, now that I have a racking cane and a racking wand. This is just using a funnel and a ladle. It's kind of slow, so I'll show you a faster method next. But it requires the use of a racking wand, bottling wand. There's the bottling wand. When you press on it, the liquid flows, and when you lift up, it stops. I cleared the tubing of water because I used water to prime the tubing. And here I'm filling a swing top bottle, and you'll see later why I use a swing top bottle. It's to test for carbonation. Now I'm filling some crown capable bottles, like regular beer bottles, which I recycle to use for making homebrew. So here we see the capping procedure. I use this antique capper. It was provided to me by a friend who no longer brews. It's very simple. You put a cap on, press it down, and it seals very tightly, airtight. And I'll just show the capping procedure for 4 bottles here. And then I'll show how I make sure I have headspace in the swing top bottle, which I use for testing for carbonation. I overfilled it a bit, no problem. I'll just pour a little out, check the headspace, and seal the swing top cap. Put your bottle. The next thing to do is cardboard box or something, because these bottles might explode as they carbonate if you don't get to them in time. And you don't want to have a big mess all over your floor if some of these bottles explode from being overcarbonated. So test for carbonation every 8 to 12 hours. And note that I have this on a cafeteria tray. That's in case a bottle explodes. It won't leak all over the floor. It will leak inside the cafeteria tray. Much easier cleanup. So, carbonation of root beer. Know the risks and take great care. Live yeast in root beer may carbonate to explosive levels. Test for carbonation every 8 to 12 hours for 1 to 2 days at room temperature. You must refrigerate and keep refrigerated once it's carbonated in the bottles. Even refrigerated brew builds pressure very slowly, so use the root beer within 2 weeks. I find that I have no problem drinking 2 gallons of root beer within 2 weeks between me and all my children. So never give root beer in bottles to unwarned friends or take on a picnic unrefrigerated and so on. This root beer will start fermenting again when it reaches room temperature, and it may explode the bottles. So I'm going to show you how to test root beer for carbonation. This is the swing top bottle that I filled earlier, and this is 42 hours after I pitched the yeast and bottled the brew.
I'm going to test this bottle to see if it's carbonated yet. And there you go. It's carbonated, so I'm going to put it in the refrigerator. And all the bottles now can be put in the refrigerator.
So that was an example of a little bit over-carbonated brew. You'll see when I open a bottle later that once it's refrigerated, the gas goes into solution and it's much less likely to foam out of the bottle like you just saw. I wasn't able to test this every 8 to 12 hours because I was away from the house for a while. So it did overcarbonate a little, but not to explosive levels. So it's important to keep it in the refrigerator. So be sure to make room in your refrigerator so you can store your brew. There you go. You absolutely must store all the root beer that's been bottled in the refrigerator or the bottles will explode. So finally, here's some root beer that has been in the refrigerator for a day or so. And as you can see, it's a very well-behaved bottle of root beer, and it's delicious. Once you've had homemade root beer, there's no going back to the store-bought stuff. I guarantee it. So, now that you've learned how to make root beer, you're prepared to brew mead. Mead is even fancier than brewing your own root beer. Say goodbye to commercial mead made with who knows what's in those barrels of, quote, honey, plus additives, plus preservatives, and so on. You can control what is in your mead. You will use many of the techniques that I've shown for root beer making. So when you brew your mead, you're prepared to do things like bottle the mead, pitch the yeast, and so on, as you'll see. And when you have that mead in those bottles, you will amaze your friends. Here are the ingredients used in a batch of mead. Now, I'll switch between talking about 5-gallon batches and 3-gallon batches. I made a 3-gallon batch of mead for this presentation, but sometimes I talk about the ingredients needed for a 5-gallon batch. Just reduce the ingredients needed for a 5-gallon batch to 3/5 to compensate for the smaller size of this batch of mead.
Ingredients for this mead are water, honey, yeast, and yeast nutrient.
Here's the ingredients for a 5-gallon batch of mead. 20 pounds of honey, which makes a show mead or a dessert mead, which is very sweet. Some people like a drier mead. 5 grams of dried Lavlin D47 yeast will be used in this demonstration. Other people prefer other yeast. This is a wine yeast, and that's what most people use for brewing mead. Not the D47 necessarily, but wine yeast, rather than bread yeast that was used in making the root beer. Approximately 3.5 gallons of bottled water. I recommend using bottled water because if you use tap water, it may contain things like chlorine, which might inhibit the fermentation process or add off flavors. And approximately 3 teaspoons of yeast nutrient blend, which I'll explain a little later. So this is the fermentation vessel, sometimes called a carboy.
The mead will be fermented in a 3-gallon glass bottle or carboy equipped with an airlock.
The airlock excludes oxygen from the brew and allows CO2 to escape as the yeast ferments the sugars.
Additional equipment for brewing includes a carboy brush, a thermometer, a racking cane with attached hose, and a hot water canning pot. For bottling mead, I use capable bottles, a bottling wand, bottle caps, and a bottle capper. The yeast nutrient I use for a 5-gallon batch of mead consists of 1 teaspoon of diammonium phosphate, 1 teaspoon of diammonium phosphate, yeast hulls, magnesium sulfate, and vitamin B complex, and 1 teaspoon of refined yeast extractive proteins.
So now that we've got all the ingredients ready, this is how I measure honey out into the pot for making the brew. I use a quart measuring cup, pour it into the canning pot, which has been immaculately cleaned. In this case, I used about a gallon of honey for a 3-gallon batch of mead. And there you go. This honey is very liquid, so I didn't have to heat this. This is a cold process heat, meaning that all the volatiles and delicate chemicals in the honey have been preserved rather than heated. Heating destroys some chemicals, some compounds, changes them, and I like to do what's called a cold brew. So I'll add water to the honey and mix it. Here's some of the bottled water. And you can see at room temperature, the honey mixes into the water quite well. No need for heat. The yeast being mixed into some hot water, not hot, less than 100-degree water, warm water. And a little honey has been mixed into that water before adding the yeast, like with root beer, to give the yeast a boost. Something to eat while it gets proofed. So now I'm going to show how to pitch the yeast and add the yeast nutrient, the first of 4 staggered additions of the yeast nutrient to the must. There goes the yeast. It's been proofed. The wine yeast. It's getting mixed into the must, which is the brew. It's no longer must. It has the yeast added. And there's the first of 4 staggered additions. It's 1/4 of the total yeast nutrient. Stir it in. Then after I finish stirring in the yeast nutrient, I funnel the brew into the carboy. Again, the carboy has been immaculately cleaned before doing this brewing. And here is a method that I found improves my mead making dramatically. I learned that aerating the mead really helps it get a good start and assures a healthy brew. I'll give another demo of this and explain the reason for aeration a little more later in this presentation. Bubbles coming up, adding oxygen to the brew. Then I prepare an airlock with water, either water or vodka. Some people use a strong alcohol because there is some concern that the fluid might be pulled back into the fermentation vessel. Atmospheric pressure and temperature changes so that there's some reverse pressure. I've never had that problem, but some people insist on using alcohol so that if liquid is pulled out of the airlock and goes back into the brewing vessel, it won't contaminate the brew. Now that the airlock has been prepared and put on the carboy, it's important to emit light from the fluid because it's photosensitive. That's the reason you usually get beer in darkened bottles, to keep the light out. So I just use a contractor bag.
Here's the mead 2 days after pitching the yeast, and you can see that there's some fermentation going on, really quite vigorously. You can see the airlock is bubbling. There went a bubble. And that means that tomorrow I'm going to do the second of 4 staggered yeast nutrient additions and aerations.
So here's some details on the staggered yeast nutrient addition. Until I did this and aerations, I had unpredictable results with my mead making. Things such as delayed fermentation, stalled fermentation, off flavors, and so on. But now I get a very consistent brew each time. There's 4 additions of yeast nutrient. You already saw one, and that was when I pitched the yeast into the must. I added the first of 4 additions. Then the second would be 24 hours after fermentation is obvious, as determined by airlock bubbling. The third addition would be 24 hours after that. And then the final addition would be 24 hours later. So the additions are about a day, staggered a day from each other after the first one of pitching the yeast. You also have to note when the airlock is bubbling for the second addition, and then the third and fourth are just a day apart. So I'm going to show how I add yeast nutrient to the brew.
This is a cup of water that I've heated in the microwave for about 10 seconds so that I can make the second addition of yeast nutrient, which gets dissolved in the water. And then I'll put it in the carboy and aerate it. It's been about 3 days since pitching the yeast in the mead.
So now I'm going to describe in more detail the reason for aeration and how I do aeration.
Okay, here's the yeast nutrient addition. I'm going to take the airlock out, put it in a clean cup, put a clean funnel on top of the carboy, add the yeast nutrient solution. And now I will start aerating the mead. I'm going to turn this light on so the aeration process will be a little clearer.
Now again, all the equipment is immaculately clean, including the bottling.
I'm using this air mattress pump,
including the hose.
very slowly because there's a lot of carbonation in this mead at this point from the yeast acting on the sugars in the honey. There it goes. And you can see that it's foaming as the CO2 is released from the mead. And the reason the carboy isn't filled all the way to the top is that I've left room for this activity. But the oxygen is an important component for the yeast to grow in this early stage of the mead fermentation. Later on, you want to keep oxygen out of the mead. Among other things, the bacteria that makes vinegar is aerobic, so you want to keep it anaerobic as it brews. So after I complete this process, I'm going to put the airlock back in place.
You might notice here that there's a lot of empty space in that carboy, and you can see the reason why it's there. If this carboy were filled to the top with the brew, when I aerated, foam would come spilling out of the carboy. 10 days after start, you'll see where we are with the brewing process.
It's New Year's Eve 2020, and it's fermenting quite vigorously now. I've topped it up so that it's a full 3 gallons, if not more. And you can see the bubbles rising as it ferments. And the airlock is bubbling about once every 4 seconds, as you can see here. About 2 weeks after the airlock stops showing activity, it's time to call the mead done, and you can bottle it at that point, or you can leave it in the carboy to age a bit. Even if you bottle it, you want to age the mead for a number of months. This is an example of good, healthy fermentation. You can see the yeast layer at the bottom of the carboy. No doubt the addition of the yeast nutrients has helped with this, what looks like a very successful batch of mead so far. And on the glorious day when your mead has finally fermented and it's completely ready to bottle, you have the pleasure of putting it in bottles and capping it for future consumption.
Complete instructions for brewing root beer and brewing mead with honey are available in PDF form by request. Thank you.